The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out at sea, the water's as blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it's very deep, deeper than any anchor can reach. Many church steeples would have to be piled up one above the other to reach from the bottom of the sea to the surface. Right down there live the sea people. Now you mustn't for a moment suppose that it's a bare white sandy bottom. Oh no, the most wonderful trees and plants are growing down there, with stalks and leaves that bend so easily that they stir at the very slightest movement of the water, just as though they were alive. All the fishes, big ones and little ones, slip in and out of the branches, just like birds in the air up here. Down in the deepest part of all is the Sea King's palace. Its walls are made of coral and the long pointed windows of the clearest amber, but the roof is made of cockle shells that open and shut with the current. It's a pretty sight, for in each shell is a dazzling pearl. Any single one of them would be a splendid ornament in a queen's crown. The Sea King down there had been a widower for some years, but his old mother kept house for him. She was a clever woman, but proud of her noble birth. That's why she went about with 12 oysters on her tail, while the rest of the nobility had to put up with only 6. But apart from that, she was deserving of a special praise, because she was so fond of the little sea princesses, her grandchildren. There were 6 pretty children, but the youngest was the loveliest of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose petal. Her eyes were as blue as the deepest lake. But like the others, she had no feet. Her body ended in a fish's tail. All the long day they could play down there in the palace, in the great halls where living flowers grew out of the walls. The fishes would swim into them, just as with us the swallows fly in when we open the windows. But the fishes swam right up to little princesses, fed out of their hands, and let themselves be petted. Outside the palace was a large garden with trees of deep blue and fiery red. The fruit all shone like gold, and the flowers like a blazing fire, with stalks and leaves that were never still. The soil itself was the finest sand, but blue like a sulphur flame. Over everything down there lay a strange blue gleam. You really might have thought you were standing high up in the air with nothing to see but sky above and below you. Rather than that, you were at the bottom of the sea. When there was a dead calm, you caught a glimpse of the sun, which looked like a purple flower pouring out all light from its cup. Each of the small princesses had their own little plot in the garden, where she could dig and plant at will. One of them gave her flower bed in the shape of a whale. Another thought it nicer for hers to look like a little mermaid. But the youngest made hers quite round like the sun, and would only have flowers that shone red like it. She was a curious child, silent and thoughtful. And when the other sisters decorated their gardens with the most wonderful things they had got from sunken ships, she would have nothing but the rose-red flowers that were like the sun high above, and a beautiful marble statue. It was the statue of a handsome boy hewn from the clear white stone and come down to the bottom of the sea from a wreck. Besides the statue, she planted a rose-red weeping willow, which grew splendidly and let its fresh foliage droop over the statue, right down to the blue sandy bottom. Here the shadow took on a violent tinge, and the branch branches was never still. Roots and treetop looked as though they were playing at kissing each other. Nothing pleased her more than to hear about the world of humans up above the sea. The old grandmother had to tell her all she knew about ships and towns, people and animals. One thing especially surprised her with its beauty, and this was that the flowers had a smell. At the bottom of the sea they hadn't any, and also that the woods were green and the fishes he saw among the branches would sing as clearly and prettily as possible. It was the little birds that the grandmother called fishes. Otherwise, never have seen a bird, the small sea princesses would never have understood her. As soon as you are 15, the grandmother told them, you shall be allowed to rise to the surface and to sit in the moonlight on the rocks and watch the great ships sailing past. You shall see woods and towns. That coming year, one of the sisters was to have her 15th birthday, but the rest of them, well, they were each 1 year younger than the other. So the youngest of them had a whole 5 years to wait before she could rise up from the bottom and see how things are with us. But each promised to tell the others what she had seen and found most interesting on the first day. For the grandmother didn't really tell them enough. There were so many things they were lying to hear about. None of them was so full of longing as the youngest, the very one who had most time to wait and was so silent and thoughtful. Many a night she stood at the open window and gazed up through the dark blue water, where the fishes frisked their tails and fins. She could see the moon and the stars through its true their light was rather pale. And yet, through the water, they looked much larger than they do to us, and if ever a kind of black cloud went gliding along below them, she knew it was either a whale swimming above her or else a vessel with many passengers. These certainly never imagined that a lovely little mermaid was standing beneath and stretching up her white hands toward the keel of their ship. By now the eldest princess was 15 and allowed to go up to the surface. When she came back, she had 100 things to tell. But the loveliest, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in a calm sea, and there, close into the shore, to look at the big town where the lights were twinkling like 100 stars, to listen to the sound of music and the noise and clattering of carts and people, to see all the towers and spires of the churches and hear the bells ringing. Just because she couldn't get there, it was this above everything that she longed for. Oh, how the youngest sister drank it all in, and when later in the evening she stood at the open window and gazed up through the dark blue water, she thought of the big town with all its noise and clatter, and then she seemed to catch the sound of the church bells ringing down to her. The following year, the second sister was allowed to go up through the water and swim wherever she liked. She came to the surface just as the sun was setting, and that was the sight she found most beautiful. The whole sky had looked like gold, she said, and the clouds, well, she just couldn't describe how beautiful they were as they sailed, all crimson and violet over her head, and yet much faster than they a flock of wild swans flew like a long white veil across the water where the sun was setting. She swam off in that direction, but the sun sank, and its rosy light was swallowed up by the sea and cloud. The year after that, the third sister went up. She was the boldest of them all. She swam up a wide river that flowed onto the sea. She saw delightful green slopes with grapevines, manors, and farms peeped out among magnificent woods. She heard all the birds singing, and the sun was so hot she often had to dive under the water to cool her burning face. In a small cove, she came upon a swarm of little human children splashing about quite naked in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away terrified, and the little black animal came up. It was a dog. She had never seen a dog before. It barked at her so dreadfully that she got frightened and made for the open sea. But never could she forget the magnificent woods, the green slopes, and the darling children who could swim on the water, although they had no fish's tails. The fourth sister was not so bold. She kept far out in the wild waste of ocean, and told them that was just what was so wonderful. You could see for miles and miles around you. The sky hung above like a big glass bell. She had seen ships but a long way off, looking like seagulls. The jolly dolphins had been turning somersaults, and enormous whales had spurted up the water from their nostrils, so that they seemed to be surrounded by 100 fountains. And now it was the turn of the fifth sister. Her birthday happened to come in winter, and so she saw things that the others hadn't seen the first time. The sea appeared quite green, and the great icebergs were floating about. They looked like pearls, she said, and yet were so much larger than the church towers put up by human beings. They were to be seen in the most fantastic shapes, and they glittered like diamonds. She had sat down on one of the biggest, and all the ships gave it a wide berth as they sailed in terror past where she sat with her long hair streaming in the wind. But late in the evening, the sky became overcast with clouds. It lightened and thundered as the dark waves lifted the great blocks of ice right up. So they flashed in a fierce red lightning. All the ships took in sail, and amidst the general horror and alarm, she sat calmly on her floating iceberg and watched the blue lightning zigzag into the glittering sea. The first time one of the sisters went up to the surface, she would always be delighted to see so much that was new and beautiful. But afterwards, when they were older and could go up as often as they liked, it no longer interested them. They longed to be back again, and when a month had passed, they said that, after all, it was nicest down below. It was such a comfort to be home. Often of an evening, 5 sisters used to link arms and float up together out of the water. They had lovely voices, more beautiful than any human voice, and when a gale sprang up threatening shipwreck, they would swim in front of the ships and sing tempting songs about how delightful it was at the bottom of the sea. And they told the sailors not to be afraid of coming down there, but the sailors couldn't make out the words of their song. They thought it was the noise of the gale, nor did they ever see any of the delights the mermaids promised, because when the ship sank, the crew were drowned, and only as dead men did they come to the palace of the Sea King. When of an evening the sisters floated up through the sea like this, arm in arm, the little sister stayed back all alone, gazing after them. She would have cried, but only a mermaid hasn't any tears, and so she suffers all the more. Oh, if only I were 15, she said. I'm sure I shall love that world up there and the people who live in it. And then at last she was 15. There now, you'll soon be off our hands, said her grandmother, the old dowager queen. Come now, let me dress you up like your sisters. and she put a wreath of white lilies on her hair, but every petal of the flower was half a pearl. And the old lady made 8 big oysters nipped tight onto the princess's tail to show her high rank. "Oh, that hurts," said the little mermaid. "Yes," said the grandmother, "one can't have beauty for nothing." How she would have liked to shake off all this finery and put away the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her garden suited her much better, but she didn't dare make any change. "Goodbye," she said, and went up through the water as light and clear as a bubble. The sun had just set as she put her head up out of the sea, but the clouds still had a gleam of rose and gold. Up in the pale pink sky, the evening stars shone clear and beautiful. The air was soft and fresh, and the sea dead calm. A large 3-mast ship was lying there, with only one sail hoisted, because not a breath of wind was stirring, and sailors were lolling about in the rigging and won the yards. There was music and singing, and as it grew dark, hundreds of lanterns were lit that, with their many different colors, looked as if the flags of all nations were flying in the breeze. The little mermaid swam right up to the porthole of the cabin, and every time she rose with the waves swell, she could see through the clear glass a crowd of splendidly dressed people. But the handsomest of them all was a young prince with large dark eyes. He couldn't have been much more than 16. It was his birthday, and that's why there was all this festivity. As the young prince came out onto the deck, where sailors were dancing, over 100 rockets wished up into the sky, broke into glitter like a broad daylight. That frightened the little mermaid, and she dived down under the water, but she quickly popped up her head again, and look, it was just as if the stars' heaven were falling down on her. Never had she seen such fireworks. Great suns went spinning around. Gorgeous firefishes swerved into the blue air. All this glitter was mirrored in clear still water. On board the ship herself, it was so light that you could make out every little rope, let alone the passengers. Oh, how handsome the young prince was! He shook hands with the sailors. He laughed and smiled, while the music went floating out into the loveliest of the night. It grew late, but the little mermaid couldn't take her eyes off the ship and the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns were put out, the rockets no longer climbed to the sky, and the cannon were heard no more. But deep down in the sea there was a mumbling and a rumbling. Meanwhile the mermaid stayed on the water, rocking up and down so that she could look into the cabin. But the ship now gathered speed. One after another, her sails were spread, the waves increased, heavy clouds blew up, and lightning flashed in the distance. Yes, they were in for a terrible storm. So the sailors took in their sails as the great ship rocked and scudded through the raging sea. The waves rose higher and higher, like huge black mountains, threatening to bring down the mast. But the ship dived like a swan through the waves, and then rode up again on her towering crests. The little mermaid thought, why, it must be fun for a ship to sail like that. But the crew didn't. The vessel creaked and cracked. The stout planks crumpled up under the heavy pounding of the sea against the ship. The mast snapped in the middle like a stick, and then the ship gave a lurch to one side as the water came rushing onto the hold. At last the little mermaid realized that they were in danger. She herself had to look out for the beams and bits of wreckage that were drifting on the water. One moment it was so pitch dark that she couldn't see a thing. But then the lightning came. It was so bright that she could make out everyone on board. It was now a case of each man for himself. The young prince was the one she was looking for, and as the ship broke up, she saw him disappear into the depths of the sea. Just for one moment, she felt quite pleased, for now he would come down to her. But then she remembered that humans can't live under the water, and that only as a dead man could he down to her father's palace. No, he mustn't die. So she swam in among the drifting beams and planks, with no thought for the danger of being crushed by them. She dived deep down and came right up again among the waves, and at last she found the young prince. He could hardly swim any longer. In the heavy sea, his arms and legs were beginning to tire. The fine eyes were closed. He could certainly have drowned if the little mermaid had not come. She held his head above water and then let the waves carry her along with them wherever they pleased. By morning, the gale had quite gone. Not the smallest trace of the ship was to be seen. The sun rose red and glowing out of the water and seemed to bring life to the prince's cheeks. But his eyes were still shut. The mermaid kissed his fine high forehead and smoothed back his dripping hair. He was like the marble statue down in her little garden. She kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently, she saw the mainland in front of her, high blue mountains with the white snow glittering on their peaks like nestling swans. Down by the shore were lovely green woods, and in front of them a church or convent. She wasn't sure which, but anyhow a building. Lemon and orange trees were growing in the garden, tall palm trees in front of the gate. At this point, the sea formed a little inlet where the water was quite smooth, but very deep close into the rock, where the fine white sand had silted up. She swam here with the handsome prince, and laid him on the sand with his head carefully pillowed in the warm sunshine. Now there was a sound of bells from the large white building, and a number of young girls came through the garden. So the little mermaid swam further out behind some large boulders that were sticking out of the water, and covered her hair and breasts with some sea foam, so that her face wouldn't show. And then she watched to see who would come to the aid of the unfortunate prince. It wasn't long before a young girl came along. She seemed quite frightened, but only for a moment. Then she fetched several others, and the mermaid saw the prince come around and smile at those about him. But no smile came out of her, for of course he didn't know she had rescued him. She felt so sad that, when he was taken away to the large building, she dived down sorrowfully onto the sea and went back to her father's palace. Silent and thoughtful she had always been, she now became much more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen on her first visit to the surface, but she wouldn't say. Many a morning and many an evening she rose up to where she had left the prince. She saw the fruit in the garden ripen and be gathered. She saw the snow melt on the peaks, but she never saw the prince, and she always turned back more despondent than ever. Her one comfort was to sit in the little garden with her arms around the beautiful marble statue which was so like the prince. She never looked after her flowers, and they grew into a sort of wilderness out over the paths, and braided their long stalks and leaves on the branches of the trees until the light was quite shut out. At last she could keep it to herself no longer, but told one of her sisters, and immediately all the rest got to know, but nobody else, except a few other mermaids who didn't breathe a word to any but their nearest Louise was able to say who the prince was. She too had seen the party that was held on board the ship, and knew where he came from and whereabouts his kingdom was. "Come on, little sister," said the other princesses, and with arms around each other's shoulders, they rose in one line out of the sea, just in front of where the prince's castle stood. It was built of glistening stone, a pale yellow, with great flights of marble steps. One of these led straight into the sea, splendid gilt domes carved above the roof, and between the pillars that went right around the building were lifelike sculptures in marble. Through the clear glass in the tall windows, you could see into the most magnificent rooms. These were hung with sumptuous silk curtains and tapestries, and their walls were covered with large paintings that were a delight to the eye. In the middle of the biggest room was a huge splashing fountain. Its spray was flung high up to the glass dome in the ceiling, through which the sun shone down onto the water and the beautiful plants growing in the great pool. Now she knew where he lived, and many an evening and many a night she would come to the surface at that spot. She swam much closer to the shore than any of the others have ever dared. She even went up the narrow creek under the fine marble balcony that threw its long shadow across the water. Here she would sit and gaze at the young prince, who imagined he was quite alone in the clear moonlight. Often in the evening she saw him go out into the strains of music in a splendid vessel that was dressed with flags. She peeped out from among the green rushes, and with the wind caught her long silvery veil, and someone saw it. They fancied it was a swan spreading its wings. On many nights when the fishermen were at sea with their torches, she heard them speaking so well of the young prince, and that made her glad she had saved his life when he drifted about half dead on the waves. And she thought of how closely his head had rested on her bosom, and how lovingly she had kissed him. But he knew nothing whatsoever about that, never even dreamed she existed. Fonder and fonder she became of human beings. More and more she longed for their company. Their world seemed to her to be so much larger than her own. You see, they could fly across the ocean in ships, climb the tall mountains high above the clouds, and the lands they owned stretched with woods and meadows further than her eyes could see. There was so much she would have liked to know, but her sisters couldn't answer all her questions. And so she asked the old grandmother, for she knew all about the upper world, as she so aptly called the countries above the sea. "If people don't drown," asked the little mermaid, "can they go on living forever? Don't they die as we do down here in the sea?" "Yes, yes," said the old lady, "they do. They have to die. Their lifetime is even shorter than ours. We can live for 300 years, but when our life here comes to an end, we merely turn into foam on the water. We haven't even a grave down here among those we love. We've no immortal soul. We shall never have another life. We're like the green rush. Once it's been cut, it can't grow green again. But human beings have a soul which lives forever. Still lives after the body is turned to dust. The soul goes climbing up through the clear air, up till it reaches the shining stars. Just as we rise up out of the sea and look at the countries of human beings, so they rise up to beautiful unknown regions, ones we shall never see." "Why haven't we got an immortal soul?" the little mermaid asked sadly. "I would give the whole 300 years I have left to live to become, for one day, a human being, and then share in that heavenly world." "You mustn't go worrying about that," said the grandmother. "We're much happier and better off here than the people who live up there." "So then I'm doomed to die and float like foam on the sea. Never do you hear the music of the waves, or see the lovely flowers and the red sun. Isn't there anything at all I could do to win an immortal soul?" "No," said the old lady. "Only if a human being loved you so much that you were more to him than father and mother, if he clung to you with all his heart and soul, and let the priest put his right hand in yours, as a promise to be faithful and true here and in all eternity, then his soul would flow over onto your body, and you too would get a share in human happiness. He would give you a soul and yet keep his own. But that can never happen. The very thing that's so beautiful here in the sea, your fish's tail, seems ugly to people on earth. They know so little about it that they have to have two clumsy supports called legs in order to look nice." That made the little mermaid sigh and look sadly at her fish's tail. "We must be content," said the old lady. "Let's dance and be gay for the 300 years we have to live. That's a good time, isn't it? Then one can have one's fill of sleep in the grave all the more pleasantly afterwards. Tonight we're having a court ball." That was something more magnificent than we ever see on the earth. In the great ballroom, walls and ceilings were made of thick but quite clear glass. Several hundred enormous shells, rose red, grass green, were ranged on either side, each with the blue burning flame which lit up the whole room, and shining out through the walls, lit up the sea outside as well. Countless fishes, big and small, could be seen swimming toward the glass walls. The scales on some of them shone purple red, on the others like silver and gold. Through the middle of the ballroom flowed a wide running stream, on which mermen and mermaids danced to their own beautiful singing. No human beings have voices so lovely. The little mermaid sang the most sweetly of them all, and they clapped their hands for her, and for a moment there was joy in her heart, for she knew that she had the most beautiful voice on earth or sea. But then her thoughts soon returned to the world above her. She couldn't forget the handsome prince, and her sorrow at not possessing, like him, an immortal soul. So she crept out of her father's palace, and while all in there was song and merriment, she sat grieving in her little garden. Suddenly she caught the sound of a horn echoing down through the water. She thought, "Ah, there he is, sailing up above, he whom I love more than father or mother, he who is always in my thoughts, and in whose hands I would gladly place the happiness of my life. I will dare anything to win him and an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing there in my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch. I've always been dreadfully afraid of her, but perhaps she can help me and tell me what to do." So the little mermaid left her garden and set off for the place where the witch lived, on the far side of the roaring whirlpools. She had never been that way before. There were no flowers growing, no sea grass, nothing but the bare gray sandy bottom stretching right up to the whirlpools, where the water went swirling around like roaring mill wheels and pulled everything it could, clutched down with it to the depths. She had to pass through the middle of these battering eddies in order to get to the sea witch's domain. And here, for a long stretch, there was no other way than over hot bubbling mud. The witch called it her swamp. Her house lay behind in the middle of an extraordinary wood. All these trees and bushes were polyps, half animals and half plants. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the earth. All the branches were long, slimy arms with supple, worm-like fingers, and joint by joint from the root up to very tip, they were continuously on the move. They wound themselves tight around everything they could clutch a hold of in this sea, and they never let go. The little mermaid was terribly scared, and she paused at the edge of the wood. Her heart was throbbing with fear. She nearly turned back, but then she remembered the prince and the human soul, and that gave her courage. She wound her long flowing hair tightly around her head so that the polyps shouldn't have to clutch her by. She folded both her hands across her breasts and darted off just as a fish darts through the water, and among the hideous polyps, which reached out for her with their supple arms and fingers. She noticed how each of them had something they had caught, held fast by 100 little arms, like hoops of iron. White skeletons of folk who had been lost at sea and had sunk to the bottom looked out from the arms of the polyps. Ship's rudders and chests were gripped tight, skeletons of land animals, and, most horrible of all, a small mermaid whom they had caught and throttled. Now she came to a large, slimy, open space in the wood where the big, fat water snakes were frisking about and showing their hideous, whitish, yellow bellies. In the middle was a house built of the bones of human folk who had been wrecked. There sat the sea witch, letting a toad feed out of her mouth, just as we might let a little canary come and peck sugar. She called the horrible fat water snakes her little chicks, and allowed them to sprawl about her great spongy bosom. "I know well enough what you're after," said the sea witch. "How stupid of you! Still, you shall have your way. It'll bring you into misfortune, my lovely princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail, and in its place have a couple of stumps to walk on like a human being, so that young prince can fall in love with you, and you can win him and an immortal soul." And with that, the witch gave such a loud, repulsive laugh that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground and remained sprawling there. "You've just come at the right time," said the witch. "Tomorrow, once the sun's up, I couldn't help you for another year. I shall make you a drink, and before the sun rises, you must swim to land. Sit down on the shore and drink it up. Then your tail will divide into two and shrink into what humans call pretty legs. But it'll hurt. It'll be like a sharp sword going through you. Everyone who sees you will say you are the loveliest human child they have ever seen. You will keep your graceful movements. No dancer can glide so lightly, but every step you take will feel as if you are treading on a sharp knife, enough to make your feet bleed. Are you ready to bear all that? If you are, I'll help you." "Yes," said the little mermaid, and her voice trembled, but she thought of her prince and the prize of an immortal soul. Still, don't forget this, said the witch. Once you have a human shape, you can never become a mermaid again. You can never go down through water to your sisters and to your father's palace. And if you don't win the princess' love, so that he forgets father and mother for you, and always has you in his thoughts, and lets the priest join your hands together to be man and wife, then you won't get an immortal soul. The first morning after the prince marries someone else, your heart must break, and you become foam on the water. I'm ready, said the mermaid, pale as death. Then there's me to be paid, said the witch, and you're not getting my help for nothing. You have the loveliest voice of all down here at the bottom of the sea. With that voice, no doubt, you think to enchant him, but that voice you shall hand over to me. I demand the best that you have for me to make a rich drink. You see, I have to give you my own blood in order that the drink may be as sharp as a two-edged sword. But if you take my voice, said the little maid, what shall I have left? Your lovely form, said the witch, your graceful movements, and your speaking eyes. With those you can easily enchant a human heart. Well, where's your spunk? Put out your little tongue and let me cut it off in payment. Then you shall be given the potent mixture. Go on, then, said the little mermaid, and the witch put the kettle on for brewing the magic drink. Cleanliness before anything, she said, as she scoured out the kettle with the bundle of snakes she had knotted together. Next, she scratched her breast and let her black blood drip down into the kettle. The steam took on the weirdest shapes, terrifying to look at. The witch kept popping fresh things into the kettle, and when it boiled up properly, it sounded like a crocodile in tears. At last, the brew was ready. It looked like the clearest water. There you are, said the witch, and cut off the little mermaid's tongue. She was now dumb and could neither sing nor speak. If the pulp should catch a hold of you as you go back through the wood, said the witch, throw but a single drop of this drink on them, and their arms and fingers will burst into 1,000 pieces. But the little mermaid had no need to do that. The polyps shrank from her in terror when they saw the dazzling drink that shone in her hand like a glittering star. So she quickly came through the wood, the swamp, and the roaring whirlpools. She could see her father's palace. The lights were out in the great ballroom. They were all certain to be sleeping there by this time. But she didn't anyhow dare to look for them, now that she was dumb and was going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart must break for grief. She stole onto the garden, picked one flower from each of her sisters' flower beds, blew 1,000 finger kisses towards the palace, and rose then through the dark blue sea. The sun was not yet up as she sighted the prince's castle and climbed the magnificent marble steps. The moon was shining wonderfully clear. The little mermaid drank the sharp burning potion, and it was as if two-edged swords pierced through her delicate body. She fainted and lay as though dead. Then the sun streaming over the sea woke her up. She felt a sharp pain. But there, in front of her, stood the handsome young prince. He stared at her with his coal-black eyes, so that she cast down her own, and saw that her fish's tail had gone, and she had the sweetest little white legs that any young girl could wish for. But she was quite naked, and so she wrapped herself in her long flowing hair. The prince asked who she was and how she came there, and she could only look back at him so gently, yet so sadly out of her deep blue eyes, for of course she couldn't speak. Then he took her by the hand and led her into the castle. Every step she took, as the witch had foretold, was as though she were treading on sharp knives and prickling gimlets. But she gladly put up with that. By the side of the prince she went along as lightly as a bubble, and he and all of them marveled at the charm of her graceful movements. Costly dresses were given her of silk and muslin. She was the most beautiful in all the castle. But she was dumb. She could neither sing nor speak. Lovely slave girls in gold and silk came out and danced before the prince and his royal parents. One of them sang more beautifully than all the rest, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. The saddened little mermaid, for she knew that she herself had sung far more beautifully, and she thought, "Oh, if only he knew that I gave my voice away forever in order to be with him." Next, the slave girls danced a graceful gliding dance to the most delightful music, and then the little mermaid raised her pretty white arms, lingered on the tips of her toes, and then glided across the floor, dancing as no one had danced before. She looked more and more lovely with every movement, and her eyes spoke more deeply to the heart than the slave girl's singing. Everyone was enchanted, and especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. Still, she went on dancing, although every time her foot touched the ground, it felt as though she was treading on sharp knives. The prince said that she must never leave him, and she was allowed to sleep on a velvet cushion outside his door. He had boy's clothes made for her, so that she could go riding with him on horseback. They rode through the sweet-smelling woods, where the green boughs grazed their shoulders, and the little birds sang among the cool foliage. She went climbing with the prince up high mountains, and although her delicate feet bled so that others could see it, she only laughed and went on and on with him until they could see the clouds sailing below them like a flock of birds migrating to other lands. Back at the prince's castle, when at night the others were asleep, she would go out onto the broad marble steps and cool her tingling feet in the cold sea water. And then she would think of those down there in the depths of the sea. One night her sisters rose up arm in arm, singing so mournfully as they swam on the water. She made signs to them, and they recognized her and told her how unhappy she made them all. After that, they used to visit her every night, and once, in the far distance, she saw her old grandmother, who hadn't been above the water for many years, and also the Sea King wearing his crown. They both stretched out their hands toward her, but they didn't venture in so near to the shore as the 5 sisters. Day by day, she became dear to the prince. He loved her as one loves a dear good child, but he didn't dream of making her his queen. And yet she had to become his wife, or else she would never win an immortal soul, but on his wedding morning would be turned into foam on the sea. "Do you like me best of all?" the mermaid's eyes seemed to say, when he took her in his arms and kissed her lovingly brow. "Yes," said the prince, "you are the dearest of all, because you have the kindest heart. You are the most devoted to me, and you remind me of a young girl I once saw, but shall probably never see again. I was sailing in a ship that was wrecked. The waves drove me shore near a sacred temple where a number of young girls were serving. The youngest, who found me on the beach and saved my life. I only saw her twice. She was the only one I could ever love in this world. But you are so like her that you almost take the place of her image in my heart. She belongs to the holy temple, so that fortune has been kind in sending you to me. We will never part. Ah, little does he know that it was I who saved his life, thought the mermaid, that I carried him across the sea to the temple in the wood, that I waited in the foam and watched if anyone would come. I saw the pretty girl he loves better than me, and the mermaid sighed deeply, for she didn't know how to cry. The girl belongs to the sacred temple, he says. She'll never come out into the world, and they'll never meet again. I am with him. I see him every day. I will take care of him, love him, give up my life to him. But now the prince was getting married, they said, married to the pretty daughter of the neighboring king, and that was why he was fitting out such a splendid ship. The prince was going off to take a look at his neighbor's kingdom. That is how they put it, meaning that it was really to take a look at his neighbor's daughter. A large suite was to go with him, but the little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts far better than all the others. I shall have to go, he said to her. I shall have to visit the pretty princess, as my parents are so insistent. But force me to bring her back here as my wife. That they will never do. I can't love her. She's not like the beautiful girl in the temple, as you are. If I ever had to find a bride, I would rather have you, my dear mute foundling, with the speaking eyes. And he kissed her red mouth, played with her long hair, and laid his head against her heart, so that it dreamed of human happiness and immortal soul. You've no fear of the sea, have you, my dumb child? He asked, as they stood on board the splendid ship that was to take him to the neighboring kingdom. And he told her of stormy gales and dead calms, of strange fishes at the bottom of the ocean, all that the diver had seen there. And she smiled at his tales, for she knew better than anyone else about the bottom of the sea. At night, when there was an unclouded moon, and all were asleep but the helmsman at the wheel, she sat by the ship's rail and stared down through the clear water. She seemed to see her father's palace, with her old grandmother standing on top of it in her silver crown and gazing up through the swift current at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up onto the water and looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. Wringing their white hands, she beckoned to them and smiled, and would have liked to tell them all that was going well and happily with her. But the cabin boy came up at that moment, and the sisters dived down, so that the boy felt satisfied that the white something he had seen was foam on the water. Next morning, the ship sailed onto the harbor of the neighboring king's magnificent capital. The church bells all rang out, and the trumpets were blown from the tall battlements, while the soldiers saluted with gleaming bayonets and flying colors. Every day there was a feast to balls, and parties were given one after another, but nothing had yet been seen of the princess. It was said that she was being educated abroad in a sacred temple, where she had lessons in all the royal virtues. At last she arrived. The little mermaid was eager for a glimpse of her beauty, and she had to admit that she had never seen anyone more charming to look at. Her complexion was so clear and delicate and behind the long dark lashes smiled a pair of trusting deep blue eyes. "It's you," cried the prince, "you who rescued me when I was lying half dead on the shore," and he clasped his blushing bride in his arms. "Oh, I'm too happy," he said to the little mermaid. "My dearest wish, more than I ever dared to hope for, has been granted me. My happiness will give you pleasure because you're fonder of me than any of the others." Then the little mermaid kissed his hand, and already she felt as if her heart was breaking. The morrow of his wedding would mean death to her and change her to foam on the sea. All the church bells were ringing as the heralds rode round the streets to proclaim the betrothal. On every altar sweet oil was burning in rich lamps of silver. The priests swung their censers, and bride and bridegroom joined hands and received the blessing of the bishop. Dressed in silk and gold, the little mermaid stood holding the bride's train, but her ears never heard the festive music. Her eyes never saw the holy rites. She was thinking of her last night on earth, of all she had lost in this world. That same evening, bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. The cannon thundered, the flags were all flying, and the amidships they had put up a royal tent of gold and purple, strewn with luxurious cushions. Here, the wedded couple were to sleep that calm, cool night. The sails filled with the breeze, and the ship glided lightly and smoothly over the clear water. As darkness fell, colored lanterns were lit, and the crew danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of the first time she came up out of the sea and gazed on just such a scene of joy and splendor. And now she joined in the dance, swerving and swooping as lightly as a swallow that avoids pursuit, and shouts of admiration greeted her on every side. Never had she danced so brilliantly. It was as if sharp knives were wounding her delicate feet, but she never felt it. More painful was the wound in her heart. She knew that this was the last evening she would see the prince for whom she had turned her back on kindred and home, given up her beautiful voice, and every day suffered hours of agony without his suspecting a thing. This was the last night she would breathe the same air as he, gaze on the deep sea and the star-blue sky. An endless night, without thoughts, without dreams, awaited her who had no soul and could never win one. All was joy and merriment on board until long past midnight. She laughed and danced with the thought of death in her heart. The prince kissed his lovely bride, and she toyed with his dark hair, and arm in arm they went to rest in the magnificent tent. The ship was now hushed and still. Only the helmsman was there at his wheel, and the little mermaid leaned with her white arms on the rail and looked eastward for a sign of the pink dawn. The first ray of the sun, she knew, would kill her. Suddenly, she saw her sisters rising out of the sea. They were pale, like her. No more was their beautiful long hair fluttering in the wind. It had been cut off. "We have given it to the witch so that she might help us to save you from dying when tonight is over. She has given us a knife. Look, here it is. Do you see how sharp it is? Before sunrise, you must stab it into the prince's heart. Then, when his warm blood splashes over your feet, They will grow together into a fish's tail, and you will become a mermaid once more. You'll be able to come down to us in the water and live out your 300 years before being changed into the dead salt foam of the sea. Make haste. Either he or you must die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother has been sorrowing till her white hair has fallen away, as ours fell before the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back to us. But make haste. Look at that red gleam in the sky. In a few minutes, the sun will rise, and then you must die. And with a strange, deep sigh, they sank beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew aside the purple curtain of the tent, and she saw the lovely bride sleeping with her head on the prince's breast. She stooped and kissed his handsome brow, looked at the sky where the pink dawn glowed brighter and brighter, looked at the sharp knife in her hand, and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who murmured in his dreams the name of his bride. She alone was in his thoughts. The knife quivered in the mermaid's hand, but then she flung it far out into the waves. They glimmered red where it fell, and what looked like drops of blood came oozing out of the water. With a last glance at the prince from eyes half dimmed in death, she hurled herself from the ship into the sea, and felt her body dissolving into foam. And now the sun came rising from the sea. Its rays felt gentle and warm on the death-chilled foam, and the little mermaid had no feeling of death. She saw the bright sun, and hovering above her, hundreds of lovely creatures. She could see right through them, see the white sails of the ship and the pink clouds in the sky. And their voice was the voice of melody, yet so spiritual that no human ear could hear it, just as no earthly eye could see them. They had no wings, but their own lightness bore them up as they floated through the air. The little mermaid saw that she had a body like theirs, raising itself freer and freer from the foam. To whom am I coming? She asked, and her voice sounded like that of the other beings, more spiritual than any earthly music can record. To the daughters of the air, answered the others. A mermaid has no immortal soul and can never have one unless she wins the love of a mortal. Eternity, for her, depends on the power outside her. Neither have the daughters of the air an everlasting soul, but by good deeds they can shape one for themselves. We shall fly to the hot countries where the stifling air of pestilence means death to mankind. We shall bring them cool breezes. We shall scatter the fragrance of flowers through the air and send them comfort and healing. When for 300 years we have striven to do the good we can, then we shall win an immortal soul and have a share in mankind's eternal happiness. You poor little mermaid have striven for that with all your heart. You have suffered and endured, and have raised yourself onto the world of the spirits of the air. Now, by 300 years of good deeds, you too can shape for yourself an immortal soul. And the little mermaid raised her crystal arms towards God's sun, and for the first time she knew the feeling of tears. On board the ship there was a bustle and life once more. She saw the prince with his pretty bride looking about for her. Sorrowfully they stared at the heaving foam, as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the forehead of the bride, gave a smile to the prince, children of the air, she climbed to a rose-red cloud that was sailing in the sky. So we shall float for 300 years, till at last we come unto the heavenly kingdom. And we may reach it even sooner, whispered one. Unseen, we float into human homes, where there are children, and for every day we find a good child who makes father and mother happy and earns their love. God shortens our time of trial. The child never knows when we fly through the room, and if that makes us smile with joy, then a year is taken away from the 300. But if we see a child who is naughty or spiteful, then we have to weep tears of sorrow, and every tear adds one more day to our time